Everyone can see the screen? Yeah. Okay, great. Well, Chris, thanks for the introduction. This first panel is about tribal ecologies, and Rocky and Matt and Jay are here. I think Shamil is not here, or may be here secretly. I'm not sure if he's coming. But basically, in this first part, Rocky, Matt, and I have, I think, 30 minutes to about 10 minutes each to talk about this idea of tribal ecologies. Let me just mention a little bit about how this project emerged. I'm doing a 2-year postdoc at the University of Copenhagen. So previous to that, I lived in India for 8 years, and I work with a tribe called Gaddi in Himachal Pradesh. And my work is not explicitly about ecology. However, I work with a transhuman pastoralist tribe that there is a lot of ecological work done. My work was primarily about tribal casteism, looking at how the state gave scheduled tribe benefits to some Gaddis, but not all, who were in the ST quota. And as a result, the state inadvertently split the community between SC and ST, which raises this question about what is the position of Dalits within tribes, which is a much larger discussion that really is a pan-India discussion that people aren't having. So the work I've been doing for the past 10 years is trying to start with the Gaddis and launch out to look at the over 700 tribes and then over 2,000 petitioning tribal communities in India to see what is the relationship of Dalits to tribal communities? How does the state adjudicate petitions for ST communities who want to move into ST quotas? And I focus on religion. So I actually look at things like Dalit conversions to Christianity, and I look at things like witchcraft. I've worked a lot with Radha Swami, with the Arya Samaj on how ST communities have their spirituality affected by the state. So when the state misrecognizes people, this can impact their spirituality. So that's what I do in South Asia. But when I came to Copenhagen, it was right after kind of COVID had calmed down, and Copenhagen had too much money because they hadn't spent it during during COVID, which is a very nice position to be in. And so all of these departments and all of these centers were forced to quickly spend their money. And this conference that I hosted is from the Center of Applied Ecological Thinking. It's called CAPE. And this was a situation where CAPE had gotten a huge amount of money, millions of dollars, right before COVID started. And then they hadn't spent any of it because of COVID. And so there was a rush to host conferences and get CAPE going. It's in this very premier, the location of the CAPE office is like right next to like an H&M. It's like in a very central part of Copenhagen, a very expensive part of Copenhagen. And so there's a lot riding on the success of CAPE, not only as a University of Copenhagen project, but as more of a public interface project. So Stefan, the director, met with me, and we talked about how I was really interested in this idea of tribal ecologies. And what we did was we invited Rocky from India. Rocky's at IIT Mumbai, and it was great that he came because he almost didn't come because of visa issues. And we got Matt to come from the US. He's at Bard College. And we also had a second day of the conference, which was with Indian scholars who are participating in a special issue that we're publishing. And so what I want to do today in just the 7 minutes I have left is kind of talk a little bit about CAPE and how it relates to environmentalism. I want to promote, I'm starting a CAPE blog, which is going to be focused on South Asian ecologies. So for the first year, we're going to have a blog, and it'll be peer reviewed. And basically, I'll be recruiting people to write about ecology in South Asia. And so this tribal ecologies project emerged. We had a conference in December, 2-day conference. This is the CAPE website. It tells you a little bit about what we're up to and the kind of outreach we're doing. It was established in 2021, and it's really just getting going right now. the point of this conference was to get Rocky and Matt to come to Copenhagen and to meet a bunch of NGO people who are also part of the university. One's an anthropologist, one's in the business school. There were some artists who came, and there's a Danish NGO called Interest that works on sustainable ecological developments in places like Jharkhand and Orissa. And so we had a conference, we all met. And then the secondary plan was that Rocky is part of the Tribal Intellectual Collective, which is a group in India of tribal scholars who publish in a tribal journal. And we decided that we would expand this project to include people like Jay Shamal. There's another woman, Changtila. And there's a German senior professor who works at kind of the international level on tribal issues. And so we have this special issue that's coming out in a few months called Tribal Ecologies. And there are three parts to this claim about what tribal ecologies is. This is one of my Gadi informants about 10 years ago. The three parts of tribal ecologies that we're trying to delineate is that all ecological claims and postures and practices that happen in India happen in relationship to the state, because the state confers tribal benefits. This ST quota, which of course began in the colonial period, it got picked up in the post-colonial period. And so there are no ecological practices that are happening outside of the state. And the state has tribal boards, and the state has specifically these state ethnographers or ethnologists who tour India, who adjudicate petitions to decide which communities are tribal. And there's a criteria that is mostly grounded in the Local Committee's 1965 delineation of the 5 qualities of tribal people. And so the first point is relatively straightforward, but it's also very complex. People like Sarah Schneiderman, Al-Basha have worked on this extensively. It's how the state recognizes and sometimes misrecognizes tribal people. And tribal people perform a tribal identity to the state, literally perform. So if you want to read about this, Townsend Middleton's book called Demands of Recognition is about how the Gorkhas perform their tribal identity to these state ethnologists who come from Calcutta for a few days. And this performance of tribal identity is integral to what it means to do anything ecologically in a tribal sense in India. There are no ecological tribal practices outside of the state because the state confers tribal status. So that's the first point. The second point is that it's certainly not reducible to that. So ecological practices, things including collective memory, there are ways to distinguish tribal communities from settled Hindu caste communities. We look at things like stories, lifeways, sacralizing rituals and practices that do express kind of unique relationships to the environment. This gets quite complicated because a lot of tribes are very settled. So the Gadi community was highly encouraged, I'll use the word encouraged, but in some cases also forcibly settled by the British colonialists in Kangra. And so agricultural settled practices have become the norm for a lot of tribal communities, but nevertheless, in the case of the Gadis, for example, very strong ecological practices that maintain in how they worship, in spirituality, and how they perform rituals. Like there's an all-night sheep sacrifice called the Nuala, which deeply expresses Gadi's relationship not only to Shiva, but to Mount Manimahesh, where Gadis believe Shiva lived, but they also believe that there's an ethnogenesis story that they come from Manimahesh and Dal Lake. There are specific mythologies and stories about Gadis who swim into Dal Lake and go under Manimahesh Mountain and learn ecological practices from Shiva. And the ritual itself, this Nuala ritual, is the literal, it is the externalization of their vertical practices to the mountains and their relationship to sheep herding. So there are certain practices that can distinguish tribal people. It's important to stress that we're not making a primordial claim that tribal practices continue in an unchanged way, because when you study tribes for a long time, you see how dynamic there are. Even Gadi identity, about who counts as Gadi, is a very dynamic question that's changed over the last few decades. In a few months, Peter Phillimore and I are co-editing a special issue of the journal Himalaya. We address this question. It's the whole point of this special issue about how Gadi identity is not even a stable category of who counts as Gadi, the enumeration of Gadi. And so ecological practices are also similarly dynamic. So things like settled farming, wage work dependency, urban migration, international migration to Dubai and stuff, all these things affect whatever it means to do tribal ecology. But the point that we're making is that tribes continue to engage in a kind of reconstitution of their community practices around living with nature. They have expressions of human ecological mutuality, of relationship to animals and non-human spirits and so on, that we define as part of a tribal ecology. Then the third part that I'm going to talk about a little bit more for the remaining time is, in an academic sense, you can't talk about tribal ecologies without talking about representation. Who represents tribes and who represents their ecological framework? I think it's relatively obvious that I'm not a tribal person. And so when I talk about tribal ecologies, I have a certain outside position. And it raises some questions that I want to talk about with regards to this project. So Rocky, Matt, and I are co-editing this special issue in the journal, Tribal Intellectual Collective Journal. And one thing we decided was really important was that we wanted to honor and continue the practice of this journal in having a tribal external reviewer. A person who is tribal will be an external reviewer. And Rocky did some interviews with the founding members of this journal, and there have been logistical problems with implementing this policy, but also there are theoretical and abstract methodological problems too that I want to talk about. The big framing of this discussion, I mean, we're talking about a specific small case of how Matt, Rocky, and I are working with the contributors to the special issue to get external review from a member of the tribe about which they're writing. Okay, so we're talking about 4 or 5 people in this case. But in the past, 18 years I've been going to India. It seems like a long time, but I've been working with tribes closely through the Fulbright program. And my big picture of this is that tribes are deeply unrepresented in a lot of things. And so the Fulbright program, for example, has various schemes to bring Indians to America. One of them is called Foreign Language Teaching Assistant, FLTA. And they had never had a tribal person ever go to the US on this program, although they were sending about 30 Indians per year. And all of them were coming from JNU, from DU, and they were elite kids who spoke English. And Fulbright was, in a sense, perpetuating this problem by recruiting from top universities. And they had a criteria that made it difficult for a variety of people to apply. So when I went to India in 2014, I had a Fulbright to do my doctoral research, and I made it my goal to spread the Fulbright program among the Gadi community. And so I promoted it, and I had an opportunity to help 5 Gadis apply for the Fulbright. 2 of them ultimately went to the US. One went to Yale, one went to UT Austin. They were possibly the first scheduled tribe people to ever participate in the Fulbright program in the United States. This is not really atypical. So my supervisor, Sue Wadley at Syracuse University, she taught at Syracuse for 43 years. She either never had an ST PhD student or had very few at the very end of her career. So I remember at some point she told me she had never had an ST student, a tribal student. That was in 2015 or 2016, she told me that. So there is a systemic problem about representation of tribes in various schemes and in academia. I mentioned this Himalaya special issue that I'm publishing with Peter Phillimore. It's all about Gaddis. We recruited 8 articles, pretty much everyone from Kriti Kapila to Richard Axelby, everyone who's ever worked with Gaddis is contributing an article. So it's like all of the world's global Gaddi scholars. We don't have any Gaddis participating in this special issue because there are no Gaddis with PhDs who had 7,000 to 8,000 word English articles to contribute. This raised all kinds of questions about how we talk about Gaddis, how we represent Gaddis. One way that we tried to work around this was that he's not even a Gaddi, but he's a tribal Dalit from Lahore Spiti who wrote this book called in Hindi called The Injustices of the Indian Constitution. We invited him to write a response to our papers. He's a lawyer, former IAS officer. And he's a tribal Dalit from Lahore Spiti connected to Gaddis. He's not even a Gaddi. So we really struggled to get tribal representation. And, you know, on the theoretical side, I think what's going on, there are a few things. One is the structural impediments to tribal people participating in English forums. I should mention Lal Chandisha, the guy who's contributing this response, is doing it in Hindi. He doesn't speak a word of English. So he's writing it in Hindi and I'm translating it into English, and we're publishing it in Hindi and in English as two separate responses. So there's often a language problem. When we think about this issue of how to include and represent tribal people, it's specifically this case now I'm talking about a tribal reviewer. So if you have an article written about a tribe and you want a tribal person from that community to review it, there are certain problems that come up that we're facing. One is very reminiscent of Kiran Narayan's famous article from, I think it's 93 or 94, called How Native is a Native Anthropologist. The point, and she works in Kangra, not with the Gaddis, but on kind of women's oral traditions in Himachal. So it's very relevant to talking about Gaddis. Kiran's simple point is that there are no insiders. There are no pure native representations. In the history of anthropology, there's been an effort to identify the pure insider who has the pure knowledge, who represents the community that you're studying. And this is a chimeria. It's not possible to find such a person. She talks about multiplex identity and how people have different identities that are activated in different contexts, and that no one represents the full community, neither insiders nor outsiders. As an outsider, you have certain identity factors that can actually pull you closer to people in the community than people within the community themselves. There can be internal divisions within the tribal community. For example, caste is a very salient feature that people don't often talk about with regards to tribes. As an outsider, I don't have a caste identity that would push me into either the ST or the SC quota, and that would have affected how I could have done research. So in some ways, as an outsider, you have certain identity strands that you can pull on to bring you closer to people. Conversely, people on the inside have forms of inside knowledge, but it's always very partial and it's very positional. That's the point that Kiran's making. And just with regards to Gaddis, the two main fault lines that if we said, well, I wrote an article about Gaddis and I really want a Gaddi to review it externally. Besides English being a problem, besides there being no one with PhDs in the Gaddi community, there's over 200,000 Gaddis, by the way. Besides those obvious issues, the other issues is that who would actually be this person that could represent Gaddis? Because Gaddis is a split community that has some in the ST quota, some in the SC quota. The state doesn't even recognize a lot of self-identifying Gaddis. ST Gaddis are usually Rajput, like Rati, and they don't recognize Thakurs, they don't recognize SC Gaddis. So when you write an article about Gaddis, at the most primary level, you would have to decide, do I want a Gaddi Rajput who's an ST, who's recognized by the state as an official Gaddi, who's listed in the Constitution as a reserved scheduled tribe? Would that person review it? Or would an SC Gaddi, which is the people that I've worked with for the past 15 years, everything I published about Gaddis have been from the perspective of Dalit, Gaddi Dalits, or tribal Dalits. A lot of people don't even recognize tribal Dalits for theoretical reasons and because of this post-colonial hangover about how Dalits don't belong in tribes. So if I was to ask a Gaddi to review an article, I would start with this problem of caste which unfortunately is not something we can just quickly throw out the window. As much as a lot of people want to not talk about caste, it is a salient feature. The other one is regional. So Gaddis live in 3 primary regions. They live in Jammu, mixed in with Muslims, where they're recognized as STs, and they have 2 different ST tribes that the Jammu government recognizes. So they split the community between Zippis and Gaddis. Then in Chamba, that's the homeland of Gaddis. That's the notional homeland where people have the kind of sense of authority to represent the community because they're living in relationship to Barmore, which is their homeland. And then in Kangra, that's a settled community that has a lot of economic power. It's places like Dharamsala, Palanpur, Bajnath. So there are different sources of authority within the Gaddi community, and people in Jammu are very cut off from the people in Kangra and Chamba. People have different interests. So you start to get a sense about how difficult it is to identify the person who would represent Gaddi community. The last thing I'll mention is that for this special issue on tribal ecologies, and Matt, Rocky, Jay, they'll talk more about the details of how they're approaching this issue of tribal ecologies. I'm just, as the editor, trying to lay out this methodological issue. We asked the contributors of this special issue to identify themselves a tribal reviewer. So like Jay is working with the Ho tribe. We asked him to find a Ho representative to do a review. Doesn't need to be a scholar. It could be a farmer. It could be a merchant. It could be someone that Jay feels like is uniquely qualified to analyze his paper and be one of the external reviewers. We'll also have an academic external review. So when we set this up, we made some basic questions that we asked to Jay, Changtingla, and Shamil. And some of these questions are like, why did you select this person? What unique perspectives do they bring? This is the external tribal reviewer. What potential bias do they have? In what ways are they an insider? How are they an outsider? And we want to remind everyone that there is no pure inside to a tribal community. I for 10 years have been advocating for what I call tribal multiculturalism, which is the heterogeneity of tribes along a variety of lines, but one of them is primarily caste. So looking at tribes as mixed caste communities that have forms of tribal casteism that block SC people from forms of recognition. So keep in mind that there is no pure insider, especially with regards to caste. How will Jay or Shamu or Changtingla, how will they work with that reviewer to help them understand their article? Because there could be a language problem. So will you read it to them? Will you translate it out of English? Will there be like an oral discussion that instead of a written text will be more orally produced, the feedback? How will you explain or re-describe the context of your paper? And then what are the advantages and disadvantages to this whole process? And the advantages are obvious, that we want to decolonize tribal studies. We want tribal reviewers who are stakeholders and have vested interest in the knowledge that we produce, especially as outsiders. But the potential disadvantages is that there are all kinds of forms of insider bias that when you come out of the community and you review a paper about your own community, I could easily imagine, I've published 10 or 12 articles now about Gaddis. I could easily imagine a Gaddi Rajput who represents the mainstream tribal community rejecting many of my papers on the grounds that Stephen has a political agenda to recognize Dalits within our tribe when in fact we don't recognize them. And that's a full line. Yeah.
We're going to have to move on.
Sure. Well, that's it anyway. So